Roosevelt.
Anybody learn anything as a result of all this? Yeah, what seems significant that came through? Maybe just a couple of thoughts. I mean, with the conversation's going here, but yes.
All those white guys.
All those white guys. Yes, okay.
Henry Wallace might have set a different tone for the post-Cold War era.
Henry Wallace might have set a very different tone for the post-war era, more consistent with Roosevelt's vision. Yeah, very interesting. Anybody else? My grandfather actually worked for Wallace. He was an assistant secretary of agriculture during his first term. And I'd always heard these myths, but I never really knew much about it. This really told me a lot more. Yeah, anybody else? Okay. Yeah, I mean, the common man, this notion of the common man. Yeah, I mean, Wallace seemed to be, you know, an authentic sort of populist without being a demagogue. You know, that he also advocated universal health care. He advocated media desegregation. I mean, he really wanted to get the jump on the post-war as a period of building as opposed to confrontation. Is that fair to say?
That's one of the great speeches of the Common Man speech of 1940. It was a counter proposal to what Henry Luce, Time magazine, was saying. It's an American century. And Luce did as much as he could to enforce that imperialism. And Wallace, it was a losing cause. A Jimmy Stewart clip sums up, unfortunately, the American dilemma. We keep having these people who lose their lost causes. Wallace was an extraordinary man. He was very educated. He was a Midwesterner. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. That was part of his problem, because he didn't blend into the Washington crowd. He didn't play poker with the guys at night, which is the way things were done, backroom stuff. And he was too straight. He was a straight arrow who'd, you know, go to bed at 9 o'clock at night or some 8 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
Have dinner at 5:30. You know, it didn't fit in.
Oliver thinks I'm like this.
And Roosevelt, you know, Roosevelt was a party animal, and he understood people. And Henry Wallace was a good guy, Buddhist. He studied Buddhism, he studied every religion, and his agricultural policies were, for that time, very enlightened.
Yeah.
And he was one of the main architects of reversing the New Deal. I mean, reversing the Depression of 1933 with his agricultural policies, which were very controversial, but resulted in success for the farmers.
Right.
It included killing animals, but there was, because we had an overabundance of them at that time. So he was famous for, his enemies said he killed pigs, you know, but there was a reason for it. Very smart man, and in so many ways, and it's an ugly story. He gets smeared in the next chapter as a communist, of course, and there's reasons. He forms a third party like Robert Kennedy wanted to do, and that third party is smeared as a progressive party, and it's a very interesting story what happens. The 48 election was tough for him, very tough. And he disappears from politics, unfortunately, but before he died, John Kennedy brought him back to the White House and acknowledged his contribution.
One of the things my grandfather actually did, I read it, I searched stuff and found little newspaper clippings where he would go to Idaho and Northern California and buy produce and buy surplus agricultural products and then ship them to poor people in Chicago and Minneapolis. I mean, that was part of Wallace's thing, was to identify all of the agricultural production and look where there were surpluses and make sure they were distributed in places where they would have a lot.
And you heard what he said here in the film on labor, the equal pay for all races.
And women.
And women, and genders. Which was, for that time, I guess, extraordinary. And of course, for that reason, he was considered a kook by a lot of the Eastern media. And Jimmy Burns was an awful man, I have to say. I mean, the more you read about Jimmy Burns, the more I dislike him, but he was certainly an enemy and did his best. And the 44 convention, it's too bad Claude Pepper always said I was 7 seconds away, 9 seconds away from nominating Wallace, and he would have gotten that through, but they cut him off. And I guess it's the way it works, you know, the Democrat. What's really changed with the DNC? I mean, they did cut off Bernie Sanders, and they cut off Robert Kennedy. And they play those kind of games.
Well, power politics is what you're finding. Now, why did you start the series in 1890?
Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm not the only author here. There's a co-author, it's Peter Kuznick, who has studied American history at American University, where he's taught it for 25 years. So he's the foundation on which I went, and I knew him for a long time, and Peter and he was the historian, I was the dramatist. So we were working together in tandem for several years. It took 4 years to put this together, and it was very difficult. Why did we start in 1900? Because that's when the whole thing changes. We go from internal politics basically to the Philippines, the Philippine War, as well as the expansion in Cuba. Don't forget we took over Cuba too, and in the Platt Amendment. And all these things started to happen around that time, and all the interventions accelerate through the 1900 period. And that shows you the beginnings of this imperialism ending in World War I. And that's a fascinating story, because the United States is basically suckered into World War I, because the British Empire runs up such a vast debt that Morgan, and we go into the Morgan story, Morgan knows they can't repay it if Britain loses, so we have to go to war for England because they got to repay their debt and repay Morgan. It's an interesting story. But World War I is Woodrow Wilson, despite his reputation, is a very contradictory figure, and somewhat like, he does things that are very, very ugly. He says he's against the war, against World War I, and then he runs on that basis he wins in 1916, and then he immediately declares we're going to go to war.
Yeah, of course.
It's very interesting history when you start in the 1890s, because it's a period of the growth of imperialism and the American empire.
I mean, that's one of the other points that comes through in this chapter, is this notion of Churchill hanging on, you know, feverishly to the notion of empire and of colonies at a time when the world seemed, you know, it would have been an appropriate time, it seems to me, to relinquish the empire. And of course, there were some places where that happened, and there's also places where the Americans gained influence, where the British lost influence. I mean, we know that in Iran in 1953, it was the British and the Americans working together to overthrow the government of Mossadegh because of oil interests there. We also know American interests expanded in Saudi Arabia during the post-war. That also the Americans, and there's an interesting film which we actually showed during the pandemic in the festival called Coup 1953. Did anybody see that?
I've seen it.
Which is about the Iranian coup, and a realization by Eisenhower at the time saying, wow, this was easy compared to what he'd been through in terms of World War II. And so there was a policy of assassination that developed in terms of the Congo and Guatemala and and Vietnam, but it didn't work so well.
Regime change.
Regime change, yeah. Anyway, are there other questions? I mean, we can keep going here, but I'm just curious to know. Yeah.
I'm wondering about it seems like the war economy is something that's managed to survive a long time.
The war economy, which has managed to survive for a long time. You talked about the comment of a permanent war economy. And certainly, yes. I mean, now, if you count Veterans Affairs and VA benefits and nuclear weapons, the budget is now $1.3 trillion a year.
It's very interesting. At the beginning of this saga, in 1945, right after the war, Senator Vandenberg, very important Republican, says to Truman, "You're going to have to keep this economy going with fear. fear was the only way the American people would unite behind these kind of budgets, and that was the war economy. And that was a big issue, because America did demobilize, and a lot of troops came home, and of course the economy was completely rocked by all these returning servicemen, and there's some very good films about that. William Wyler's Best Years of Our Lives. There was a very tough dislocation going on, and the women who were employed were suddenly, many of them were fired or let go, and it was just the strikes, the labor union strikes. It was tremendous agitation throughout, and Eisenhower dealt with that. And not Eisenhower, I mean, sorry, Truman kind of stumbled his way through, and then the Korean War began, of course, and the Korean War is a Cold War, continued, and that allows us to stay in the war economy. By 1950, we're building up again in Korea because we were unprepared to fight. So a lot of the World War II veterans found themselves in Korea. That was a tough fight, and up at the Yalu River there, that was quite something. And Doug MacArthur plays a huge role here, which that's another story unto itself, but it's his hubris, his military hubris. And Truman becomes a hero by fighting against MacArthur, which makes sense because MacArthur was out of control. He wanted war with China. So Truman had, many things were good about Truman, but at the same time, he did put us on a war footing with the Soviet Union, and he really misbehaved. The way he treated these people, he misunderstood the spirit of Roosevelt, but that's Roosevelt's fault too, because Roosevelt didn't train him, didn't bring him in. And on the other hand, it's the greatest tragedy in my mind was that Roosevelt, if only he had lived a few more months to August, with the Japanese decision to drop the bomb, which was unnecessary, and we go into great detail on this in chapter 3, that the bomb was unnecessary, and of course, you run into this turbulence, but one of the reasons it says the American invasion of Japan is scheduled for November 1. The Soviets get there in mid-August. They're going to go to Japan. Japanese are terrified of the Russians, and it becomes a huge factor in their surrender, which is never mentioned. But if you remember, the Russians shot the Emperor of Russia back in 1919. They shot him. So the Japanese knew that Russians were not going to have any qualms whatever about getting rid of Emperor Hirohito. And that was a huge factor also that's completely overlooked here. The Russians were on their way. They defeated the 2 million man army. They really beat the shit out of them in Manchuria in a big battle, and they kept coming. They were going to come across that body of water.
First, yeah.
So I assume you're going to cover this in
Chapter 3.
chapter 3, but my understanding is Jimmy Burns' gradual transition from being an advisor to independently running foreign policy.
Jimmy Burns'
Secretary
transition
of State at the end of this movie.
from
And then-
being an advisor to being in charge of foreign policy.
And being a primary architect and convincing Truman to drop the bomb
And convincing Truman to drop the bomb.
Oh, Jimmy Burns is a key factor. And, you have James Forrestal, too. The Forrestal story, that one. It's defense minister. He jumps out the window. But we'll save that for another chapter.
Did you feel that FDR would have dropped the bomb? Would FDR have dropped the bomb?
Not even close. Not even close. Roosevelt was a very compassionate man. He saw the world as an alliance. He saw Great Britain, he saw China, which was shaky, but okay, China, US, Britain, and Russia would be the 4 dominant players in the New World Order.
Something that shows up in Oliver, is it chapter 8 about Reagan and Gorbachev? Is it chapter 8 or chapter 5? I can't remember. Anyway, it's one of the chapters. That Gorbachev, and I know some of this story because I'm interested in trying to figure this stuff out too. Gorbachev put on the table total nuclear disarmament. Total nuclear disarmament. And knowing that it was draining, first of all, the Soviet economy beyond any chance of survival long term, But also, Gorbachev made a speech. He came to the United States to speak at the UN. There was 100,000 people lining the streets of Broadway as he arrived. Does anybody remember that, Gorbachev's arrival here? And he spoke to the UN, and in that speech he said the two greatest evils in the world are militarism and poverty. And that poverty, in fact, had been exacerbated by militarism, and that it was time for the world to turn away from militarism and join forces to address poverty. So, I mean, I knew that speech. But I did not know, and of course there were negotiations in Reykjavik, and there was a time where American advisors were trying to prevent the first meetings with Gorbachev, who had been in power some time, and the Europeans were warming to him, and the Europeans were saying, you've got to meet with him, or else we're going to make independent deals. Reagan loved Gorbachev. I mean, the first meeting, Gorbachev got Reagan to walk off for 45 minutes with one translator, and the advisors were freaking out. And they're saying, where is he? Where is he? And Reagan comes back and says, I love this guy. He says, I invited him to come to Washington, in Tula. And they're, oh man, what are you talking about? Anyway, because Gorbachev was having a lot of influence. But the idea that in his close negotiations with Reagan, that he actually put on the table total nuclear disarmament, which, because of Reagan's attachment to Star Wars, for one thing, was his holdout position. But I mean, when I think that so recently there was an opportunity to actually turn away from nuclear weapons, it seems to me extraordinary. Because my view, we still need to think about that.
I want to ask you about the way that you made the picture. About 4 or 5 minutes into it, it felt to me I was watching an old-time newsreel. One narrator, the pictures, and you continued it. Was that a conscious decision not to use, say, talking heads or scholars?
Yeah, conscious decision. We had no time for talking heads. Talking heads slow, you have to have a debate. No, we have a narrative, and we're telling that narrative as a history teacher might in a classroom. But we wanted to mix it up. We used a lot of film clips, actually. You may not have seen many here, but in all the chapters, there's a lot of film clips, and we used actors to give as much voice as we could to the quotes that are known. Some of the quotes were not available vocally, but some were, and we do put on, I don't know why, there was no, the subtitles should have been here because some of the footage is not hearable, what they're saying, but we had the actual speech, the text of the speech, and actor portrayal was said, if it was an actor. But in the case of Churchill, that is Churchill.
Other comments, questions? Yes, right back here.
About the timing thing, yeah, about pacing. So are you timing the scripts, and because the material is so dense and you have so much time, as you said, so are you timing the script and then finding the archival footage after, adding that at the last step? Or?
Are you writing the script first and then finding material to illustrate it?
Peter and I, yes, we went around and around and around. I think we cut this thing several times, but it was something. When I went to school, I dropped out and went to Vietnam, and I had my own story. My education was spotty, and much more so than I thought, because I thought I knew history pretty well because I read it all the time. But Peter is doing this professionally. This is his profession. And he many times humbled me because I thought, of course that happened, that's true. And it's not true. You have to go to the sources, and that's what historians do. So everything is fact-checked twice in this whole series. It was quite a number, but we had to fight with the fact-checkers sometimes because they didn't even know some of the stuff that we were digging up, which a lot of it came from foreign files too, Soviet files.
Yeah, and Stalin died in what, 52?
53.
And fairly quickly after that, there was an effort to sort of repudiate
Absolutely.
Stalin's excesses, and Khrushchev
Oh, it was huge, yeah.
Yeah.
Khrushchev gave the famous 55 speech where he said he drove the Chinese nuts with that speech. He was relaxing the tension in the world. Yeah.
Yes.
Just on the filmmaking side as well. So obviously, these things are fact-checked to a T and everything's legitimate, but do you have a battle between historical accuracy versus like the dramatic storytelling of the project? Like, is that ever like something that like you have issues with, or like?
You know, you can't override historical accuracy. Now, you can disagree on what the facts are. And certainly there'll be some people who will defend the United States decision to drop the bomb on Tokyo. And I've heard all the counter-arguments, but I don't believe them. But I think Peter's arguments, for me, dominate, and they're based on the facts that we have. Now, if other facts come out, for example, the Soviet Union suffered even more casualties. That's come out since then. It was up 27 million, and I've heard now 37 million. Every Soviet, when you go to Russia, you realize how many, every family is affected by this war. The grandparents, someone died in this, they really went through.
Yeah, I mean, I was recently reading about the, 30 million people killed in Russia, and some historians actually believe that Russia endured a permanent trauma because of World War II. Do you know what I'm saying? That Russia endured a permanent trauma on World War II that has a lasting cultural impact that is very difficult to overcome.
Well, Russia was invaded by Napoleon, don't forget. And that was there were a lot of battles back then. Borodino was no joke. So they lost a lot of people, but they've been invaded by Poland also separately and then there were the two huge invasions of World War I, World War II. So yeah, of course, they are very aware. And Russian people are very tough, and they've been through war. They're much more attuned to it. And I have to say, at this present moment, I think Mr. Biden and his group, the neoconservatives in Washington, have driven them quite concerned and agitated. I'm sensing from my contacts that they are really ready for a war with the United States. They don't want one at all. They've been trying to play this thing in Ukraine down, keep the fires going at a simmer, but they do have an objective, which is we don't even pay attention to, we don't listen to their red lines, we don't even we have no diplomatic communication with them, which they want, but we don't want.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the question of the current world condition and the lack of diplomacy to be effective is extremely troubling because of how charged militarily, and people have been saying it for years, that military solutions appear to be taking the place of actual building of diplomacy. And I think one of the things that comes through here is that Roosevelt's diplomacy was fairly specific, fairly careful, fairly thorough. He showed up. He was the guy who was there to talk. And that's a rarity at this time. And also that these are negotiations where leaders went in not knowing what the outcome was going to be. In other words, it wasn't, let's go in and sort of soft touch this and do that and have photo ops. They were actually negotiations that had to be productive, which requires compromise when that's the case. But this notion of war and trauma, I mean, I think it's worth thinking about. I mean, the United States certainly underwent trauma because of the Civil War, no question about it. And it lasted for a very long time, and some could argue that it's not resolved today. That Russia endured this trauma. Obviously, the way Jews were persecuted and killed under Hitler is a lasting trauma. I'm sure there is trauma. I think even in the United States there's trauma as the result of the Vietnam War. We don't even think about what the traumatic impact is in Vietnam. And this question then of how it distorts the potential for human progress, the way war is this disruptive force. I mean, 80 million people were killed in wars in the 20th century. It's one of the and
just in World War II, I think.
Yeah. Just in World War. Yeah.
World War I adds on about 30 or 25.
Yeah. So I mean, this is this huge question. And as we approach new technology, as we approach AI, as we approach the proliferation of nuclear weapons, it just seems to me to have urgency. And I don't know whether. That's why I'm so shocked that we came to the threshold of possibility of eliminating nuclear weapons as recently as the 1980s. And I'm a little flabbergasted by it, and obviously I don't have a solution, but are there other questions?
We've got one in the back here.
Yes.
How do you view the other chapters?
What's that now?
How do you view the other chapters?
They're available, you say they're...
Yeah, it's on Amazon. Amazon, you can rent it, and now you can't stream it. For some reason, they can't stream it right now, but you can rent it on DVD, Blu-ray, from Amazon or from Doc. You can get it for free from Doc Plus, right?
Yeah.
Doc Plus.
You can get it free, but it has advertisements. And they're
And
basically
are you
the same
choosing-
advertisements.
That's the documentary channel, Doc Plus. It's called DocPlus.com.
And if you watch it once, it'll be Kamala Harris ads. And if you watch it a second time, it'll be Trump ads.
Are you
Same ads
juicing?
repeating themselves over and over again.
Are you juicing to do the 2024 election?
Are you going to do the 2024 election? Are you going to do a chapter?
Oh, come on, I can't chase the news, you know that. Movies take time, and they take a lot of effort. It's interesting, time, but they're all interesting. Every election is, most of them are really very tense, and as you can see, I mean,
You know, it's interesting. After Nixon came out, Oliver's movie on Nixon, somebody said, I don't particularly like Oliver Stone's version of Nixon. And somebody else said, well, at least he's got a version. I mean, part of the question for me is how it is that we can become more animated in our understanding and application of history. I mean, you know, given the complexities of the time we face. And I applaud Oliver in digging into this and identifying, as I say, what I believe are inflection points where a path not taken has results in terms of the path taken, and to better understand that in terms of where we are and how we proceed. But that dialogue needs to become more active, because in some ways, to me, the fire hose of information right now, this minute, blocks us from actually reaching back in some ways and connecting with other historical events and reflections and even lessons learned that could be applied, because we're just so inundated with information right now. We're overdosed to a certain extent. Anyway, another question. We probably should take one or two more. Yes, right here.
You talked about the number of deaths in this 20th century and such like that. But one of the things I don't think gets talked about enough is the impact that war has on climate change.
The impact that war has on climate change. Yeah, absolutely. Not the least of which is fighting for oil.
Not the least of which is our military, what they spend in terms of carbon dioxide. All this, the military contributes a great deal. The military around the world, particularly the United States military, contributes a huge amount of emissions that are counted that go up into the atmosphere and making this place a hothouse. So yeah, aside from that, there's no cooperation. But not that we need it. We can, you know, first of all, we got to agree on the methods to achieve clean energy. I made another documentary, and it's very controversial too, but it's about nuclear energy and its power and its ability to get things done. And it was done 2 years ago. It's out on Amazon also. Nuclear Now. That's my feeling, among other things. The renewables are certainly, they're good, but they need methane gas. They need methane gas to back them up. Otherwise, they don't work. And methane gas is proven to be as dangerous as any carbon dioxide, especially in the short term. In fact, it's more dangerous. So methane is a real problem right now, and it's been noted finally but the media is so bad. It's so bad. They're so meek. They don't really seem to get focused scientifically on hard facts. They don't tell you. They always tell you. They scare you. They scare you with nuclear energy. They talk about renewables as if they're the only solution. They're nuts.
This is like William F. Buckley and his various debatees. Yeah, I've seen Oliver's movie on nuclear energy, and I mean, you should watch it. It's a totally reasonable argument, basically saying that the need is so urgent that we need to create vast sources that can come online and be sustainable. He talks about France. He acknowledges, what the arguments have been in terms of nuclear power. I was certainly one of the people that was opposed to, proliferation of nuclear power plants, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, he asks for reconsideration of it, and I think it's, again, worth thinking about. Anyway, one last comment. Yes, Kevin, yeah.
I just wanted to say I really appreciate your films and the work you've done. And particularly, I enjoyed the interviews you had with Putin. I think particularly at this time when it's so easy to not have a sense of empathy or understanding, I so appreciated just the opportunity to understand somebody who's far more complex than we're shown here at the meeting.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Empathy was that word I put up on the screen, and I feel very strongly empathy is required. Imagination now. We have to walk in the other person's shoes to understand this world. And you have to walk in your enemy's shoes, so-called enemy, if he is your enemy.
Right. So in other words, to create dialogue where there is a tendency to block oneself off. I mean, I've actually not seen all the Putin interviews. I've seen some excerpts. I've seen Oliver's interviews with Fidel Castro. And I came away saying the questions he asks are exactly the right questions. And they include questions of, isn't it contradictory to promote, progressive social change and revolution and then hang on to power for 50 years? I mean, it's not done in a confrontational way. It's just done in, let's just have a conversation about this. Tell me what you think. And these are questions I think that come up with. And so Oliver's position, and has courted controversy in doing so, is to say, yes, why shouldn't we hear what Fidel Castro has to say? We're not going into, enable him or bow down or anything else. We're going to raise legitimate questions. He had an interview with Hugo Chavez, same thing. His most recent film is a film about Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, who was in power and then put in jail and now is back in the presidency in Brazil. We don't know a lot about da Silva. We get fragments of information, so it serves a purpose. And I think it's to Oliver's credit that he goes to the front line and digs it out. In the same way we watched Platoon last night. It's a difficult movie. It is so intense, but it says, okay, you want to know what it was? This is what it was. Okay, and he was there. He got a Bronze Star. He got a Purple Heart. He was on the front line, and this is what Oliver has brought to the, to the conversation, to try to open up windows of understanding, and you can agree or disagree with them, but I think that to advance that conversation in a way that cuts below the surface has served a great purpose. And so I think, thank you for that.
Thank you.